What are the fundamentals? How do things link together?
Discern between the differences in the fundamentals.
The fundamentals.
One fundamental question.
We've made some really fundamental bad decisions.
In the fundamental era.
Fundamental interaction.
This fundamental trade-off.
A fundamental fact. Absolutely fundamental.
Fundamental aspect. Fundamentally.
The fundamental.
The fundamental laws of the universe.
The fundamental work.
In a fundamental sense.
But they don't mean anything if you don't understand something much more fundamental.
Fundamental.
A fundamental role.
A fundamental pillar.
Fundamental way.
Fundamental.
The fundamental skills.
Fundamental sense of oneness.
The fundamental assumptions.
A fundamental right.
And we lack a fundamental understanding.
The fundamental. Start with fundamental research in the fundamental ways that really matter.
More fundamental.
It is one of the fundamental things, the fundamental point of
Fundamental limits. The fundamental problem of traffic.
Let's dive into some of the more fundamental questions.
Some of these fundamental questions.
This fundamental distinction.
Really fundamental.
Something really fundamental, very fundamentally.
Profound and fundamental questions. They are all fundamental.
Some of the most fundamental, some of the most significant, and some of the most life-changing discoveries.
Fundamental social challenges, a fundamental issue. Some fundamental questions.
They were asking me a fundamental question. Fundamental ways.
fundamental.
But which one is more fundamental?
All the fundamental skills.
Fundamental.
Fundamental.
That is fundamental, that is foundational.
The same fundamental gospel.
The fundamental things.
The fundamental environment.
Fundamental challenge.
A fundamental and meaningful change. A fundamental change in the existing order.
A fundamental reality.
Fundamental healthy habits.
A fundamental tone problem.
3 fundamental pillars.
And more fundamental.
Fundamental.
The most fundamental things, I think.
Fundamental.
Information is fundamental.
A fundamental reason.
It is the fundamental way.
And that's so fundamental. It is so essential.
A bit of a very fundamental change.
Something more fundamental. A fundamental law.
The fundamental tenet.
The fundamental aspects.
I want more fundamental research.
This is the fundamental part, the fundamental basis.
The fundamental human rights. More fundamental.
A fundamental change.
That's a fundamental principle.
And that's a fundamental principle.
And a fundamental principle.
The fundamental principle.
It's a more fundamental principle.
The fundamental principle.
The most fundamental principle.
The fundamental principle of
How central is that sort of just fundamental principle?
This indeed is the fundamental principle.
The fundamental principle.
The fundamental principle.
These are the sort of fundamentals.
The fundamental rule.
Fundamental rule.
Fundamental.
The fundamentals.
The fundamental rule of.
This is not a fundamental rule. This is the fundamental of fundamentals.
This fundamental rule.
The fundamental rule.
It's a fundamental rule.
This fundamental rule.
It's a fundamental rule.
A fundamental rule.
The fundamental rule.
A fundamental phenomenon.
Fundamentally.
That fundamental rule.
These are the fundamentals.
That most fundamental.
The fundamental rule.
It's the most fundamental rule of
Fundamentals.
the fundamental forces. That's the fundamental rule here.
That's a sort of a fundamental rule.
No, but the fundamental rule.
A fundamental rule.
The most fundamental rule. Fundamental rule.
Fundamental idea.
Take a little while and grasp this fundamental idea. The fundamental idea. The fundamental idea.
The fundamental idea.
The fundamental idea.
It's this fundamental idea.
The fundamental idea.
The fundamental idea.
The fundamental idea is this is so simple. It's such a fundamental idea.
Is this fundamental idea?
It's a really different fundamental idea.
A fundamental idea. The fundamental idea.
On this fundamental idea.
That's the fundamental idea. Fundamental idea of
The fundamental idea.
The fundamental idea. The fundamental idea.
The fundamental idea. This fundamental idea.
The fundamental idea. The fundamental idea.
The fundamental idea.
The fundamentals.
Sure, yes. Get some good training of the fundamentals.
The fundamentals.
The fundamentals.
The fundamentals. Fundamentals.
The same fundamentals. And I think those fundamentals are the foundation.
Those fundamentals.
The fundamentals.
The fundamentals.
Fundamentals, basics, how to understand fundamental.
So I think it actually is a good reason for everyone to focus on really the fundamentals.
Some of the basic fundamentals.
Underlying fundamentals. All these skills are possible to teach, and they're all driven from basic fundamentals.
And they had a problem because they didn't understand the fundamentals.
I want some of the fundamentals.
I don't understand the fundamentals.
Fundamentals. These fundamentals.
Fundamentals.
Some of the fundamentals.
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 Yeah. Fundamentals.
At the end of the day, the fundamentals work.
You've got to stay true to those fundamentals, you know.
These are the fundamentals.